The photograph had been handled so many times that the edges had gone soft. The corners bent into gentle curves from the pressure of Eleanor Voss's fingers. She kept it tucked inside the front cover of her Bible, a small square of paper that had come all the way from Harrowgate, Wyoming, wrapped in a letter she had read until the words felt like her own heartbeat. James Aldridge. The name had weight to it, the kind of solid, unhurried weight that a good man's name ought to carry. He had written to her first in November, responding to the small advertisement she had placed in the Prairie Courier, 4 lines that had cost her 2 weeks' wages from the seamstress shop and every shred of her considerable dignity. Young woman of sound character and capable hands seeks correspondence with a man of honest purpose in the Western Territories with the intention of marriage. His reply had come on a Tuesday, in a plain envelope, in handwriting that was not elegant but was deliberate and careful, as though every word had been considered before it was committed to the page. He wrote of his horse ranch outside the town of Harrowgate. He wrote of open country in cold winters and the particular quality of the light in September when the grass turned the color of old honey. He was a widower, 40 years old, not given to sentiment, but not without feeling. In his 4th letter, the one she returned to most often, he had answered her shy question about the house with a single line that had settled something restless inside her. The parlor has a wide stone hearth. You will never be cold. A wide stone hearth. It was such an ordinary thing. But Eleanor Voss, who had spent 3 winters in a boarding room in Cincinnati with a single window that rattled in the wind and a landlady who charged extra for coal, understood exactly what that line cost him to write, and what it promised. She was 22 years old. Her mother had died of fever the previous spring, her father long before that, and there was nothing left in Ohio but the memory of cold and the smell of machine oil from the factory district 2 streets over. She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk, her good dress, her sewing kit, her mother's silver thimble, the 6 letters from James Aldridge, and she had bought a ticket west. The train journey took 4 days. She watched the country change outside the window like a slow, irreversible story, the green softness of the east giving way to flat amber plains, the plains shouldering upward into rock and sky. By the time the conductor called Harrowgate Junction, the world outside the glass looked nothing like anything she had ever known, and the flutter in her chest had long since hardened into something quieter and more serious. She stepped down onto the platform in the late afternoon. The sun was still high and fierce. The air was dry and smelled of sage, and something mineral, something she had no name for yet. She smoothed her traveling coat, adjusted her hat, and stood still, looking. The platform was not empty. There were a handful of men moving freight, a woman with 2 small children, a station agent in a green visor. But none of them were looking at her, and none of them matched the photograph she had been carrying next to the Word of God for 6 months. She waited. She was practiced at waiting. The freight was loaded. The woman with the children left. The station agent went back inside. The last of the sun slid behind the ridge to the west, and the air, which had been warm, turned sharp and cool with startling speed. The platform was empty now except for Eleanor and her trunk and the long blue shadow of the water tower stretching east across the boards. He was not coming. The certainty arrived, not all at once, but the way winter comes first, a suggestion, then a fact. She did not allow herself to collapse under it. She sat down on the bench beside her trunk, folded her hands in her lap, and permitted herself exactly 1 minute of absolute stillness while she took account of her situation. She had $9. She had a trunk. She had no acquaintance within 400 miles. The nearest train east did not depart until morning. She would need a room. The station agent had gone home. The platform was deserted. A buckboard came rattling down the dirt road from the direction of town, moving at an unhurried pace, a single horse and a single driver. The driver pulled up at the edge of the platform and climbed down, not looking at her, going directly to the freight bay and checking a crate that had been left there. He was tall, younger than she expected, perhaps 30, perhaps a few years more, with dark hair pushed back under a worn hat and the kind of lean, capable look that came from years of outdoor work. His coat was dusty. His boots were muddy at the heel. When he turned and saw her, he stopped. He did not stare. He simply registered her presence the way a man registers a change in the weather, quietly and completely. He glanced at her trunk. He glanced at the empty platform. He looked at her face, and in that brief, honest look, he read the entire situation without a single word being spoken. He walked toward her. His steps were unhurried. "Ma'am." His voice was low and even, carrying no particular curiosity. "Last southbound came through an hour ago." "I know." Her own voice was steadier than she felt. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then, without preamble, "Town's a quarter-mile up the road. There's a hotel, the Prairie Rose. It's decent." He paused. "I can put your trunk in the wagon if you'd like a ride." She looked at him. She had been taught her whole life to be cautious of strangers, and every lesson her mother had ever given her rose up in that moment. She looked at his hands, calloused, still, not fidgeting. She looked at his eyes, which were gray and direct and entirely without cunning. "Thank you," she said. "I would be grateful." He lifted her trunk into the wagon bed as if it weighed nothing. He did not offer to help her up onto the seat, but he waited until she was settled before he climbed up himself and clicked the horse forward. They drove in silence. Eleanor looked straight ahead at the road, watching the lights of Harrowgate resolve out of the dusk, a main street, a general store with its windows still lit, a saloon, a white-steepled church at the far end. "I'm Gideon Hale," he said, without looking at her. "Eleanor Voss." He nodded once, as though her name confirmed something he already suspected, and said nothing more. He set her trunk on the porch of the Prairie Rose and spoke a few quiet words to the man behind the desk. And when Eleanor tried to ask the price of a room, the desk man looked slightly past her and said it had been settled. She turned to find Gideon Hale already at the door. "Mr. Hale." He paused. "I don't know how to thank you properly." "No need." He touched the brim of his hat and walked out into the evening. She stood in the small, clean lobby of the Prairie Rose and listened to the sound of the buckboard moving away down the street, and she allowed herself, then, to feel the full weight of the day. The tears, when they came, were silent and brief. She permitted them that much. Then she washed her face in the basin in her room and sat on the edge of the bed and thought very carefully about what she was going to do next. The following morning, she presented herself at the town's only law office, 2 rooms above the hardware store, belonging to a man named Aldous Pratt, who was both the local magistrate and the notary public, and asked, carefully and without dramatic detail, whether there was any work available in Harrowgate that might suit a woman who could read and write with accuracy and keep accounts in good order. Aldous Pratt, who was 70 years old and had been keeping his own books in a state of shameful chaos for a decade, looked at her over his spectacles for a long moment and hired her on the spot to sort out 3 years of billing records at a rate of 50 cents a day. It was not enough to live on indefinitely, but it was enough to buy her time. On her second day in Harrowgate, she encountered Gideon Hale outside the general store. He was loading feed sacks, and he paused when he saw her, and tipped his hat, and said nothing. And she thanked him again for the room. And he said again that it was no trouble, and they went their separate ways. On her third day, a tin pail of eggs appeared on the chair outside her hotel room door. There was no note. She had no way of knowing for certain who had left it. But there was only one person in Harrowgate who owed her nothing and had helped her anyway. She mentioned it to the woman who ran the Prairie Rose, a brisk and capable widow named Frances Cook, who smiled a small, knowing smile and said nothing at all. It became a pattern. Every few days, something would appear: a jar of preserves, a small parcel of dried venison wrapped in brown paper, a bunch of dried sage tied with a bit of string as if it were a bouquet and not a practical herb. There was never a note. She never saw him leave these things. He was a man who expressed himself in action, not language, and slowly, without her entirely meaning to, she began to watch for those small, quiet offerings the way she once watched for letters. She had been in Harrowgate for 3 weeks when the truth about James Aldridge surfaced, and it surfaced the way most uncomfortable truths do, sideways, from an unexpected direction, in the middle of an ordinary moment. She was in Aldous Pratt's office, working through a stack of outstanding invoices, when two women came in to have a deed witnessed. They were talking as women talk, when they have forgotten there is anyone else in the room. "Heard Aldridge is back from Cheyenne," one said. "Brought his daughter home from school. Lord, that man. I don't know how Clara puts up with him. Off every few months like he doesn't have a wife and a household to answer to." Eleanor's pen stopped moving. The scratch of it against the paper ceased so abruptly that the silence was almost audible. She kept her eyes on the invoice in front of her. Her hand, when she looked at it, was perfectly steady. She was proud of that later. She set the pen down with great care. She gathered the papers she had been working on into a neat stack. She placed them precisely at the edge of the desk, and then she sat very still and breathed through the cold, clarifying fury that moved through her from her feet to the crown of her head and back again. A wife, Clara. A daughter away at school. He had not been a man who changed his mind. He had been a man with a household who had amused himself with a stranger's hope, and then when she had not appeared, when the train had come and gone without a woman matching her description, had simply resumed his life as though the whole correspondence had been nothing more than a pleasant diversion. She excused herself early that afternoon and walked the full length of Harrowgate's main street and back 3 times, until the cold fury had settled into something hard and manageable at the center of her chest. She had options. She could report the fraud to Aldous Pratt, who was both her employer and the local magistrate. There were federal statutes against mail fraud. She had all 6 letters. She had evidence enough to make James Aldridge's life considerably uncomfortable. She thought about it for the length of 2 full passes down the main street. She thought about what it would mean, her name spoken publicly, her story a matter of civic record, her foolishness preserved in the ledger of official documents alongside deeds and wills and livestock disputes. She thought about the wife, Clara, who had done nothing wrong. Who would have to sit in a small town and watch her husband be publicly shamed for a scheme she may not have known about? Eleanor walked to the end of the street, turned around, and walked back. And by the time she reached the door of the Prairie Rose, she had made her decision. She would let it go. Not for his sake, never for his sake, for her own, because carrying the weight of revenge meant carrying him, and she refused to give him that much space in her life for a single day longer. She told no one except Gideon Hale. She had not planned to tell him at all. It came out on a Thursday evening 3 days after the discovery, when he had stopped by Aldous Pratt's office to have a bill of sale witnessed and found her still there at the desk in the late afternoon, staring at nothing with her pen held loosely in her fingers. He sat down across from her, uninvited, with the easy authority of a man entirely comfortable with silence, and waited. She had not realized until that moment how much she had needed someone to tell. She told him plainly and without embellishment. She told him about the letters, about the advertisement, about the photograph worn soft at the edges. She told him what she had overheard and what she had decided and why. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. His jaw was set, and there was a stillness to him that was not passive but contained, like a river banked high. "I could speak to him," he said. His voice was very level. "No." She met his eyes. "I've already decided. I won't let him have another minute of my time." He looked at her steadily. Then, slowly, he nodded. Not in agreement exactly, but in the way a man nods when he recognizes something in another person that he had suspected was there and is now confirmed. "That's the hardest kind of courage," he said. "Letting a wrong thing go." "It's not courage," she said. "It's arithmetic. The cost of revenge is higher than the reward." Something shifted in his expression then. Something that had been careful and considered moved, just slightly, toward something less guarded. He stood up, took his bill of sale, touched the brim of his hat, and left. But the following morning, there was a small carved wooden horse on the chair outside her room. It was no bigger than her fist, its lines clean and precise. Every muscle of the animal suggested rather than stated. She held it in her palm for a long time before she set it on the windowsill where the morning light could reach it. She had been in Harrowgate for 2 months when Aldous Pratt, who was not an unkind man, sat her down and told her that his billing records were now by his estimation, the finest in the territory, and that while he was grateful, he had nothing left to offer her by way of work. She thanked him sincerely. She went back to her room at the Prairie Rose and sat on the edge of the bed and calculated $9 against the cost of a room and 2 meals a day. She had a week, perhaps 10 days if she was careful. She was composing an advertisement in her head. Woman of good education and domestic skill seeks work of any honest kind when there was a knock at her door. It was Francis Cook, the owner of the hotel. She handed Eleanor a folded note without comment and went back downstairs. The note was short and written in the same deliberate, careful hand she had last seen on a bill of sale. I am told your work for Mr. Pratt is finished. I have a horse operation 3 miles north of town. The records for the past 4 years have not been kept in any sensible fashion, and I am not able to correct them myself. If you are willing, I will pay a fair wage and provide your board at the hotel. I can come tomorrow if the answer is yes. There was no signature. There did not need to be. She read it twice. She folded it precisely along its original creases. She sat with it in her hands for several minutes, understanding that this was a turning point of some significance and that she ought to think carefully before she answered. She thought about the eggs on the chair, the preserves, the carved horse on the windowsill. She thought about a man who had helped a stranger on an empty train platform without asking for anything, who had paid for her room and vanished into the dark as if kindness were a private matter, not a performance. She thought about the way he had listened when she told him the worst of it, without pity and without prurience, with only that level, quiet attention. Then she went downstairs and told Francis Cook to send word to Gideon Hale that the answer was yes. His horse operation was called the Rimrock, a name that suited it, a working ranch set back against a long shelf of red sandstone, with a barn, a small bunkhouse for the 2 hands he employed, and a main house that was plain and well built and had clearly been kept clean by a man who believed in order, even if he didn't believe in comfort. He showed her to a small room off the kitchen that had a desk and a window and a hook on the wall for her coat. A lamp already burned on the desk. She did not comment on the lamp. He did not explain it. The records were exactly as terrible as promised. 4 years of transactions recorded in 3 different notebooks, 2 ledger books, and a series of loose papers held together with a leather lace. Receipts were stuffed into a tin box without organization. There were no totals anywhere, no running balances, no reconciliation between income and expenditure. For a woman who thought in columns and order, it was something between an offense and a puzzle, and she settled into it the way she settled into everything she was good at, with quiet, total concentration. Gideon was on the property most days, working in the barn or out on the range, but she heard rather than saw him the ring of a hammer, the sound of a horse being worked in the corral, the low murmur of instruction to one of his hands. He came in for water sometimes in the afternoon and would pause in the kitchen doorway and look at the progress on her desk without speaking. Once, in the 2nd week, he set a cup of coffee beside her elbow, without a word, and was gone before she could look up. She learned his rhythms the way she had learned to read the sky back in Ohio, slowly, through repeated observation, until the signs became legible. She learned that he rose before light, and that he moved through the early morning with the quiet efficiency of a man who had long ago made peace with solitude. She learned that he did not eat until the work was done, and that he read in the evenings serious books, not novels. She learned that he was a man who laughed rarely, but when he did, it transformed him entirely, like sunlight breaking through clouds that have been settled in for weeks. She learned these things, and she did not examine too closely what it meant that she was learning them. She finished the records in early spring. 4 years of chaos resolved into order, every receipt accounted for, every transaction placed in its proper column. She set the completed ledgers on the kitchen table one evening while he was eating supper, and he put down his fork and opened them and looked through them slowly. He did not look at the numbers. He looked at the order she had made, the way everything had a place and everything was in it. When he closed the last ledger, he was quiet for a long time. "The work is done," she said carefully. She watched him. He nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. Outside, The wind moved through the new grass with a sound like water. I suppose it is. He was not looking at the ledger anymore. He was looking at the window, at the last thin line of rose light at the edge of the sky. A muscle worked in his jaw. The spring gather starts next week. I could use someone to record the head count, the weights, keep track of the sale figures. His voice was steady, deliberate, the voice of a man choosing words with great care. I could keep doing the accounts, she offered, just as carefully. Yes, he said, and then, after a pause, and the mending, the shirts. She looked at his collar, which was held together on one side by what appeared to be determination rather than thread. The shirts, she agreed, and so she stayed. The weeks took on a new shape. The work was no longer only about numbers. She cooked the evening meal, and they ate together at the kitchen table, and the silence between them, which had started as the silence of strangers, had become something warmer and more specific. She planted a kitchen garden along the south wall of the house, beans and squash and a row of sunflowers that she told herself were practical and that she suspected were not. Gideon said nothing about the sunflowers. She saw him studying them one morning from the barn doorway, with an expression she could not quite read, but which did not look like displeasure. The truth about her past still existed between them, but it had changed shape. It was no longer a raw wound, but a scar present, acknowledged in the space of their silences, but no longer the first thing either of them thought about in the morning. She had chosen to build forward, and every day she spent at the Rim Rock was a brick in that new structure. He understood this without being told. He was a man who understood a great many things without being told. It was an evening in late May. The last of the sun was still warm on the porch boards, and she was sitting in the chair by the door, repairing one of his work shirts, her needle moving in and out of the heavy cotton with a quiet rhythm. He came and sat on the porch steps, leaning back against the rail, his long legs stretched out in front of him. They had been sitting this way in the evenings for weeks. It was their ordinary time, the hour between the end of the day's work and full dark, when neither of them was in a hurry to go anywhere. Eleanor. She looked up. He was looking out past the corral, not at her, his profile steady against the last of the light. His hands were resting on his knees. She recognized this as a man gathering himself. She set the shirt down. She waited. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice a notch lower than usual. "About the Rim Rock." He paused. "About how this place has been for a long time, since Margaret died." She had known from Francis Cook that his wife had died 4 years ago. He had never spoken of it directly. She said nothing, only listened. "I got used to quiet," he said. "I told myself I liked it." He turned his head and looked at her then, a direct, steady look. "I was wrong." She held his gaze. Her heart was doing something complicated inside her chest, but her hands were still. "I am not going to tell you things I'm not sure of," he said. "That's not my way, but I am sure of this." He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees. "You came here because somebody else made you a promise he had no right to make. I can't fix that. But I can tell you that whatever I offer you, I mean." He looked at her steadily. "I would like you to stay. Not as my bookkeeper, not as someone I pay wages to." He paused. His jaw was tight with the effort of saying plain things plainly. "I would like you to stay as my wife, if you're willing." The evening was very still. A nighthawk called once, somewhere out in the dark above the corral, its cry trailing off into silence. Eleanor looked at Gideon Hale, at the lines that work and weather and grief had put in his face, at his hands that were rough and careful and left things on windowsills without taking credit. She thought about the woman she had been 6 months ago, sitting on a train platform in the dark with nothing but a photograph and a set of broken promises. She thought about the woman she was now, who knew the name of every wildflower along the creek and could read the weather in the set of a man's shoulders. Gideon. Her voice was quiet and certain. "I think I have been hoping you would ask that for quite some time." The slow smile that moved across his face was rare enough to be worth waiting for. It started at the corners of his eyes and worked its way down, and in it She saw everything that his words had not yet gotten around to saying. They were married on the first Saturday in June in the small white church at the end of Harrowgate's main street. Frances Cook stood with Eleanor and pressed her hand before the ceremony and did not quite manage to keep the tears from her eyes. The two ranch hands stood with Gideon, looking uncomfortable in their good shirts. The whole town came, as small towns do, drawn by the gravitational pull of a love story that had unfolded slowly and in plain sight over the winter and spring, and there was a general feeling of satisfaction in the pews, the feeling of a story arriving where it was always meant to go. Gideon held her hand during the ceremony with a gentle, absolute certainty. His hand was warm and rough and steady, and she understood, holding it, what the word home had always been reaching toward. 4 years later, the October light lay long and golden across the kitchen floor of the Rimrock. Eleanor stood at the east-facing window, the one Gideon had added to the kitchen the spring after they married. Without announcement, a small alteration that she had come to understand was not small at all, watching the sun come up over the ridge. Behind her, the sounds of the house were beginning. The thud of small feet on the stairs, the particular shriek that meant her daughter, Clara Rose, had taken something from her brother Thomas that she considered hers. "Give it back. I only looked at it. Mama." Eleanor did not turn from the window immediately. She stayed for one more moment in the early light, her coffee cup warm in her hands, the sun laying itself across the kitchen floor in a long, bright band that reached almost to the table. "Thomas Hale." Gideon's voice, from the direction of the stairs, was low and measured and entirely effective. Silence. Then 2 pairs of feet padding rapidly in opposite directions. She heard him come into the kitchen. She heard the familiar sound of him pouring coffee. Then he was beside her at the window, looking out at the same view, his shoulder near enough to hers that she could feel the warmth of him. "Red sky this morning," he said. "Rain coming tonight, maybe." He looked at her profile, in the way he had been looking at her for 4 years directly, with a quiet attention that still had the capacity to stop her breath. "You're thinking about something." "I'm thinking about how a lie can turn into a signpost," she said. She turned to look at him. "How something false can point you in the direction of something true." He considered this, the way he always considered things, she said entirely, without rush. Then he lifted his coffee cup, just slightly, as though proposing a toast. "Arithmetic," he said. She smiled. It was the word she had used that day in Aldous Pratt's office, when she was explaining why she would not pursue revenge. He had not forgotten it. He never forgot anything she had said, and she had long ago understood that this was its own kind of love language, the love of a man who listens. She touched his arm briefly, her fingers resting on the worn flannel of his sleeve. Outside, Thomas had reappeared in the yard, chasing the dog with the energy of a small force of nature. Clara Rose was on the porch steps, arranging a line of pebbles in some order. Only she understood, her father's serious eyes in her mother's patient face. "It's a good window," Eleanor said softly. Gideon looked at the light coming through it, at the way it lay across his kitchen floor, his wife's profile, the edge of his coffee cup. "Took me long enough to put it in." "You were slow," she agreed. In the same tone she might say, "You are kind," or "You are mine." He reached over and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his thumb resting for a moment against her cheek. The house behind them was filling up with sound, the dog barking, Clara Rose's voice rising in objection to something Thomas had done, the particular domestic music of a morning in full progress. It was not a quiet house. It had not been quiet for a long time. She looked at the light. She looked at her husband. She looked at the 2 small people out in the yard who were hers, who were theirs. It was not the life she had set out for on a November morning, with a photograph in her Bible and a stranger's promises in her luggage. It was better. It was wider and harder and more real, and it was entirely, unreservedly hers. The hearth in the parlor was cold this morning. It was too mild to need it, but she had thought of it only yesterday and felt the same warmth she always did. He had not promised her a view. He had not promised her a window. He had simply added one, quietly, in the early spring, without a word, the way he did everything that mattered. It was not a paper promise. It was a stone wall and a wooden frame and the morning sun coming through, steady and warm and permanent, the way love is when it is built by hand. Sometimes the cruelest detours are the ones that deliver us exactly where we were meant to be. Eleanor didn't find the life she planned, she found the one she deserved, built not on pretty letters but on quiet coffee left without explanation, on a carved horse set in morning light, on a window added to a wall without a word. The right people show up not with promises, but with presence. Keep your eyes open for them. A small note for you: this story was imagined and written by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of warmth and entertainment, and to leave behind one small light worth carrying.